The
Thing
moment I
about
walked
growing
into the
old is you
courtroom, my
realize
daughter
what
Emily
truly
gave a little
matters.
laugh, and my
It's not the
son-in-law Marcus
things you
Hayes shook
gather,
his head with
but the
open contempt.
moments you share.
I was
Looking
wearing my
back
simple
now, I
country
realize
clothes,
those
worn
moments were
boots,
the
and
ones
held an
that
old
truly
hat in my
mattered.
hands.
Just
I looked
us,
like a
the
lost
quiet,
farmer, a
and the
confused
warmth of
old
the
man
hearth.
who didn't
I remember the
understand where he
winter of
was.
'48 clear as
I
day.
saw Emily whisper
The
something
snow
to
piled
Marcus, and
higher
he
than his
smiled with that
stove, and
arrogance
we
that
thought
had
we might
always
not make
defined
it.
him. I heard her choked laugh, a sound that cut through my chest like a knife. To them, I was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a silly old fool who had no business being there. But then the judge looked up. His eyes met mine. I watched as the color drained from his face as his hand trembled on the wooden gavel. His lips moved, and he whispered something that silenced the entire courtroom. "My God," he said, "it's really him." Everyone turned to look at me. The silence became so thick I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Emily stopped smiling. Marcus frowned confused, staring at the judge as if he'd lost his mind. They had no idea who I truly was. Not until that moment. Because to them, I was just Pop the old man who lived in a little farmhouse, the man they had ignored for years, the obstacle they now wanted to declare incompetent so they could take everything. But what they didn't know was that this courtroom had been my second home for 35 years, that every corner of this place held my footprints, and that the man sitting behind that bench owed me everything he was. If you've ever felt that your own family cast you aside, that they treated you as if you were invisible, as if everything you had done in your life was worthless, then you know exactly how I felt that morning. But let me tell you how I got there. How the daughter I raised, the one I loved more than my own life, decided I was useless. It all started 3 months earlier. My name is William Morgan, Will, to my friends, though I haven't had many of those in recent years. For the past 5 years, I've lived alone in a small farmhouse in the Georgia countryside, about 4 hours from Atlanta. I moved there after my wife Sarah passed away from cancer. We had been married for 42 years, and when she was gone, the city held too many memories, too many ghosts, so I retreated to the country, to simplicity, to quiet. My days followed a reliable pattern. Wake at dawn, tend to my small vegetable garden, feed the chickens, read books, watch the sunset. I didn't need much more. At 72, I'd found a kind of peace in this solitude, though sometimes the silence of the house would press against me like a physical weight. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was on the porch drinking coffee, watching the sun burn off the morning mist. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer it. Few people had my number, and even fewer used it. But something intuition perhaps made me pick up. "Pop, it's Emily." My daughter's voice sounded strange too, controlled, too cold. Emily usually called on Sundays, brief obligatory conversations that felt more like status reports than meaningful exchanges. A Tuesday call was unusual. "Is everything all right?" I asked. A pause. "Uncle Thomas passed away." The world stopped. Thomas, my older brother, my only brother, my best friend, gone. What, how, I managed to ask, my voice suddenly hoarse. "Heart attack, in his sleep. They found him this morning." Each sentence clipped, precise, devoid of emotion. "We need to talk about his estate. There are legal matters to resolve." I could barely breathe. Thomas was gone, and I hadn't even been there to say goodbye. My older brother, the man who had taught me to be strong when our father died, the man who always believed in me even when no one else did. But Emily didn't ask how I felt. She didn't offer comfort. She only spoke of papers, property, and inheritance. "We'll need you to come to the city," she said. "There are documents you have to sign." Something in her tone bothered me, but I was too overwhelmed by grief to pay attention. "Of course," I said. "I'll come tomorrow." "Good. We'll expect you." The line went dead, and I sat there clutching the phone, tears running down my weathered face. Thomas and I were more than brothers. We were like two halves of the same soul. Though he'd stayed in Atlanta to build his law practice, while I moved to the countryside, we spoke weekly. He was my connection to the world I'd left behind, the keeper of our shared memories. And now he was gone. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of grief. I packed a small bag for the trip to Atlanta, moving mechanically through the motions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking of Thomas, remembering our childhood, our early struggles, the way we'd protected each other. I remembered how he'd supported my decisions even when he disagreed with them, how he'd respected my choice to retreat from the world after Sarah died, though he'd never understood it. The 4-hour drive to Atlanta the next day seemed endless. As the rural landscape gave way to suburbs and then to the city itself, my anxiety grew. I hadn't been back in years. The city had changed, grown taller, more crowded, more impersonal. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Emily and Marcus lived in an enormous house in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods. It was the kind of place that seemed designed to impress rather than to live in all soaring ceilings in cold marble. Nothing like the warm, modest home where Emily had grown up. Marcus opened the door. He didn't greet me with a hug or even a warm handshake. He simply nodded and stepped aside to let me pass as if I were a delivery person rather than his wife's father. "Mr. Morgan, Shay," he said, not Pop or Dad or even Will. Just Mr. Morgan, formal and distant. Emily was in the living room surrounded by papers. She hugged me quickly, an empty embrace without warmth. "Sit down, Pop," she said, pointing to the sofa. "We have important things to discuss." I sat. Marcus stood behind her, arms crossed, looking at me as if I were a problem he needed to solve. Emily began to talk about Thomas's inheritance, a large property on the outskirts of the city, valued at over $800,000, along with investments and bank accounts. "Thomas left everything to you, Pop," Emily said, but her voice didn't sound happy. It sounded annoyed, frustrated. "But you live alone in the country. You don't need all that. You don't know how to handle that kind of wealth. You could lose everything." Marcus intervened then with that grave, authoritative voice he always used when speaking to me. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "the sensible thing would be for you to let us handle this. Emily is an attorney. I have business experience. We can make sure everything is managed correctly." I looked at both of them. Something churned inside me, a silent alarm starting to ring. "Managed," I asked, "or kept?" Emily's face hardened. "Don't be ridiculous, Pop. We're trying to help you. You don't understand these things. You've been living like a hermit for years. The world changed, and you stayed behind." Her words hurt more than she could ever imagine, because she was right about one thing. After Sarah died, I had withdrawn from everything. I had moved to the country to live in peace, away from the noise and lies of the city. But that didn't mean I was a fool. It didn't mean I had forgotten who I was before that quiet life. "I need time to think," I told them. "I'm not signing anything today." Emily exchanged a look with Marcus, a look I didn't like at all. "All right, Pop," she said with a forced smile. "Take your time, but not too much. There are legal deadlines to meet." That night I slept in their guest room. The bed was too soft, the room too cold with its efficient air conditioning. I couldn't close my eyes. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And my instinct, the instinct that had saved me so many times in my life, told me not to trust them. Not even my own daughter. The next morning I woke early, a lifetime habit that hadn't changed with age. The house was quiet. I got up and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen, thinking I'd make some coffee. But as I approached, I heard voices, Emily and Marcus, speaking in low tones. I stopped, standing silently in the hallway, just out of sight. "He's a stubborn old man," Marcus was saying. "If he won't sign willingly, we'll have to do it the hard way." "I know," Emily replied. "That's why I hired the lawyer. We're going to declare him incompetent. With his age and the fact that he lives alone, isolated, it will be easy to convince a judge that he's not fit to handle an inheritance like this." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My own daughter, my little Emily, the girl I had carried in my arms, who had cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak, who had screamed with joy when I gave her the keys to her first car, that girl was now planning to rob me, to destroy me, to take the only thing my brother had left me. I stood there in the shadows as they continued talking, planning, plotting my destruction as if I were an unimportant obstacle. And at that moment, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let this happen, because if Thomas had taught me anything, if I had learned anything in all those years, it was that a man doesn't give up. No matter how dark the night gets, no matter if the one who betrays you is your own blood. I returned to my room, packed my bag, and left. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't want them to know I had overheard. I drove back to my little house in the country, my mind racing with thoughts, plans, memories. As I drove, I thought about my life, about the choices I had made. After Sarah died, I had chosen to disappear, to retreat from the world that had taken her from me. I had abandoned my past, wrapped myself in anonymity and simplicity. I had become exactly what Emily thought I was, an old man in worn clothes who didn't understand the modern world. But that wasn't the whole truth, not even close. Back at my farmhouse, I climbed up to the attic, a place I hadn't visited in years. In the corner under a sheet was an old trunk. I pulled off the sheet, stirring up dust that danced in the beams of sunlight coming through the small window. The lock was stiff with disuse, but the key still worked. Inside were the remnants of another life, my life before the farmhouse, before the quiet, before the grief. Photographs in silver frames, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, letters, awards, a judge's gavel given to me as a gift. And underneath it all, a business card faded but still legible. William Morgan, attorney at law. For 35 years, I had been one of Georgia's most respected criminal defense attorneys. I had fought impossible cases, defended the innocent, when no one else would build a reputation that opened doors and commanded respect. Until Sarah got sick, and nothing else mattered but being with her. After she died, I couldn't bear to return to that life without her support, her belief in me. So I walked away, told no one where I was going, became a ghost. Now looking at these remnants of my former self, I felt something stir within me. Not just anger at Emily and Marcus's betrayal, but a reawakening of something I thought had died with Sarah. Purpose, determination, fire. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I still remembered by heart, though I hadn't called it in 5 years. A woman's voice answered, professional and crisp. Reed and Associates, how may I direct your call? Charlotte Reed, please, I said. May I ask who's calling? I hesitated only a moment. Tell her it's Will Morgan. There was a pause then. One moment, please. The wait seemed eternal. Then a familiar voice, older now, but still unmistakable. Will, is it really you? Charlotte Reed had been my law partner for over 20 years. Brilliant, tenacious, loyal to a fault. When I left, she had continued the practice under her own name, respecting my desire to disappear. It's me, Charlotte. I need your help. Where are you? What happened? We all thought. I know what you thought, I said, and I'll explain everything. But right now I need a lawyer, the best one I know. You're in luck, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I happen to be available. Where can we meet? The next day, Charlotte drove out to my farmhouse. When she saw me standing on the porch, she stopped for a moment, taking in my appearance. The flannel shirt, the worn jeans, the gray beard I'd grown. Well, she said, climbing out of her luxury sedan, looking completely out of place in her tailored suit and heels. You certainly committed to the disappearing act. It wasn't an act, I said, leading her inside. This is my life now. Was your life, she corrected, until your daughter decided to have you declared incompetent. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her everything, Thomas's death, the inheritance, Emily and Marcus's plan. Charlotte listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. So, she said when I finished, your daughter and son-in-law think they're dealing with a confused old farmer who won't know how to defend himself. They have no idea who you really are. No, I said. Emily was 10 when I won the Harrison case. She doesn't remember the headlines. And after that, I kept my work separate from home as much as possible. Sarah didn't like the spotlight. And now I need to stop them from taking what's mine. Not just the money, I don't care about that, but my dignity, my autonomy. Charlotte nodded. I've been keeping tabs on you, you know, she said. All these years, just in case you ever came back. I looked at her, surprised. You have. Of course, she said with a certain wrong. You were the best lawyer I ever knew, Will. That doesn't just disappear. I've kept tabs too, I admitted. On you, on Kevin Harris, on all the others. I know you've done well. I know Kevin's on the state Supreme Court now. We've done all right, she said, but it was never the same without you. We spent the rest of the day reviewing Thomas's will, the legal strategies Emily might use, our counter-arguments. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my kitchen floor, Charlotte looked up from her notes. They've already filed the petition, she said. Preliminary hearing is next week. So soon. They're moving fast, probably hoping to get it done before you can mount a defense. Then we'll be faster, I said. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived. Emily and Marcus had hired Dominic Parker, no relation to Charlotte, a slick, high-priced attorney known for his aggressive tactics. They clearly expected me to show up alone, confused, unprepared. Their faces when I walked into the courtroom with Charlotte at my side were priceless. Emily's mouth actually fell open, and Marcus's eyes narrowed with suspicion. They hadn't anticipated that I would have representation, much less one of the most respected attorneys in Georgia. Judge Helen Martinez presided over the preliminary hearing. She was younger than me, probably in her early 60s, with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Your Honor," Parker began, "we're seeking to have William Morgan declared incompetent to manage his financial affairs. Mr. Morgan is 72 years old and has been living in isolation for the past 5 years. He has no contact with the outside world, no understanding of financial matters, and is wholly unprepared to manage the substantial estate left to him by his late brother." Martinez looked at me, her expression neutral. "Mr. Morgan, do you wish to respond?" I stood up, feeling the weight of Emily's stare. "Your Honor, du topo." Parker looked annoyed at the interruption. He had expected to face a doddering old man, not someone who understood courtroom procedure. I turned to face my daughter, Emily. I said, my voice steady and clear, "I may be old, I may live alone, but I have never and will never lose my dignity or my right to make my own decisions." Emily flinched but quickly recovered. "This is for your own good, Pop," she said, her voice cold. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Judge Martinez rapped her gavel lightly. "Ms. Hayes, you'll have your turn to speak. Mr. Morgan, please continue." "Your Honor," I said, turning back to the judge, "I am fully competent to manage my affairs, including my brother's estate. I have legal representation, and we are prepared to contest this petition vigorously." Charlotte then laid out our initial defense, presenting evidence of my independent living, my sound decision-making, and my right to privacy. "Your Honor," she concluded, "this petition is not about Mr. Morgan's competence. It's about control of assets. The petitioners stand to gain financially if Mr. Morgan is declared incompetent. This creates a clear conflict of interest." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "I'm setting this matter for a full hearing in 2 weeks. Mr. Parker, you'll need more than assertions about Mr. Morgan's age and living situation. Ms. Reed, I'll expect a comprehensive evaluation of Mr. Morgan's competence." As we left the courtroom, Emily tried to approach me. "Pop, please," she began, but I held up a hand. "Not now, Emily. We'll talk through our lawyers." Her face flushed with anger or shame, I couldn't tell which. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder, glaring at me as if I were the villain in this story. Back at my farmhouse, Charlotte and I began preparing in earnest. We knew that Emily and Parker would do everything possible to paint me as incompetent. They would focus on my age, my solitary lifestyle, my apparent withdrawal from society. "We need to be thorough," Charlotte said. "They'll bring in experts, geriatricians, psychiatrists to evaluate you." "Let them," I said. "I have nothing to hide." "There's something else," Charlotte said, looking through the case file. "The judge for the full hearing has been assigned, James Baldwin." The name hit me like a physical blow. "James Baldwin, are you sure?" Charlotte nodded. "You know him." "I knew him a long time ago." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields that had been my refuge. 35 years ago, James Baldwin was a 19-year-old kid accused of armed robbery. He was facing 15 years. I defended him. And he was innocent. I proved it. Afterward, I encouraged him to go to law school, helped him get scholarships, mentored him during his early career. I turned back to Charlotte. "I haven't seen him since Sarah got sick. He wouldn't know I'm living out here like this." Charlotte smiled slowly. "Well, well, isn't that interesting?" Over the next 2 weeks, we prepared meticulously. Charlotte arranged for independent psychological evaluations that confirmed what we already knew. I was perfectly competent, just private. We gathered evidence of my daily activities, my correspondence with Thomas, my management of my own finances, modest as they were. Parker, meanwhile, was building his case on superficial evidence, my reclusive lifestyle, my avoidance of technology, my simple clothes and unassuming home. But beneath it all was the implication that no truly competent person would choose to live as I did when they could be living in luxury in the city, surrounded by success. The day of the full hearing arrived. I dressed, as I always did, simply practically. Charlotte had suggested I wear a suit, but I refused. "They want to prove I'm pretending to be something I'm not," I said. "I won't play that game." "It's not about games, Will. It's about perception. Judges are human. This particular judge," I said, "knows exactly who I am, or who I was." And so I walked into the courtroom in my flannel shirt and worn boots, holding my old hat in my hands. Emily laughed when she saw me, and Marcus shook his head with contempt. To them, I looked like the confused old man they needed me to be. Judge James Baldwin entered the courtroom and everyone rose. He was in his mid-50s now, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with the weight of the decisions he'd made over the years. He didn't look at the gallery as he took his seat, focused instead on the papers before him. In the matter of the competency of William Morgan, he began, his voice deep and formal. Then he looked up, his eyes scanning the courtroom until they found me. The change in his expression was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face. His hand trembled slightly on his gavel. "My God," he whispered, just loud enough to be heard in the sudden silence. "It's really him." Every head in the courtroom turned to look at me. Emily stopped smiling. Marcus frowned, confused, looking back and forth between me and the judge, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Baldwin cleared his throat. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced abruptly. "Counselors in my chambers, please." As he stood to leave, his eyes met mine again, and I saw in them a mixture of shock, recognition, and something that looked like reverence. In Baldwin's chambers, away from the public eye, the truth began to unfold. Emily and Marcus sat stiffly on one side of the room, Parker beside them. Charlotte and I sat on the other side. Baldwin stood behind his desk, still looking at me as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. 35 years ago, he said, addressing the room but looking at me, "The man you're trying to declare incompetent saved my life. I was 19, accused of a crime I didn't commit, facing 15 years in prison. No one believed me. No one except William Morgan." Emily's eyes widened. Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Morgan didn't just get me acquitted," Baldwin continued. "He mentored me, encouraged me to go to law school, supported me when I had no one else. Everything I am today, my career, my position, my understanding of justice, I owe to this man." "Your Honor," Parker began. "While this is certainly a touching story," Baldwin held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Parker, I'm not finished. What you and your clients may not know is that before Mr. Morgan retreated from public life, he was known as the Guardian in legal circles. For 35 years, he was one of the most brilliant defense attorneys this state has ever seen. He won 127 major cases. He saved 17 innocent people from death row. He was legendary." Emily was staring at me now, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. "Pop," Emily said, her voice small, "is this true?" I nodded slowly. "It is." "But you never told us. After Mom died, you just disappeared. Became this farmer." "I needed peace, Emily. After your mother died, I couldn't bear to continue the work without her. She was my anchor, my compass. When she was gone, I had to find my own way." Baldwin looked at Parker. "In light of this information, Mr. Parker, do you wish to reconsider your petition?" Parker, ever the professional, recovered quickly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Mr. Morgan's past accomplishments, impressive as they may be, don't necessarily reflect his current capacity. People change. Cognitive abilities decline. The fact remains that Mr. Morgan has chosen an isolated existence, rejecting modern conveniences and social connections that most people consider essential." Baldwin nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We'll proceed with the hearing." He looked at me. "But I want to be very clear, Mr. Morgan. This court will treat you with the respect you've earned through a lifetime of service to justice." When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. Word had somehow spread, perhaps through the bailiff or the court reporter, about who I really was. The spectators were murmuring, stealing glances at me, pointing discreetly. Baldwin called the court to order, and the formal proceedings began. Parker presented his case first, calling expert witnesses who had never met me, but were prepared to testify about the general cognitive decline associated with aging and isolation. He showed photographs of my simple farmhouse, my basic lifestyle, trying to paint it as evidence of incapacity rather than choice. Then it was Charlotte's turn. She called her own experts, who had actually evaluated me and found me fully competent. But her masterstroke was calling Kevin Harris, now a justice on the state Supreme Court, as a character witness. Kevin entered the courtroom like the distinguished jurist he was, his presence commanding immediate respect. He smiled when he saw me, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. After being sworn in, Kevin began to speak. "I've known William Morgan for over 40 years. We worked together on the Danielson case in 1985, the Williams appeal in 1990, and dozens of others. He was the finest legal mind I've ever encountered and one of the most principled men I've ever known. Parker objected. Your Honor, while Justice Harris's testimony is compelling, it relates to Mr. Morgan's past, not his present capacity. I'm getting to that, counselor, Kevin said smoothly. I've stayed in contact with Mr. Morgan over the years, even after his retreat from public life. His intellect is as sharp as ever. His decision to live simply isn't a sign of decline. It's a philosophical choice, one that I frankly have sometimes envied. Emily was watching Kevin with a stunned expression. This man, this Supreme Court justice, was speaking of her father with profound respect, describing a person she had never really known. Parker tried to recover. Justice Harris, when was the last time you actually spoke with Mr. Morgan? 2 months ago, Kevin replied without hesitation. We discussed the Hawkins decision and its implications for Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. It was always an illuminating conversation. Parker looked frustrated. This wasn't going according to his plan. He tried a different approach. Even if Mr. Morgan's intellectual capacity remains intact, the fact remains that he has chosen an extreme isolation that raises questions about his judgment. No reasonable person would... Kevin interrupted, his voice sharp. Mr. Parker, reasonable is not synonymous with conventional. Some of our greatest thinkers have chosen solitude. Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond. Einstein in his later years. The desire for simplicity and contemplation is not evidence of incompetence. In many cases, it's evidence of wisdom. Parker persisted, but it was clear he was losing ground. When he finished his cross-examination, Charlotte asked if I wanted to testify in my own defense. I nodded and took the stand. As I was sworn in, I looked at Emily. Her earlier mockery had been replaced by confusion, perhaps even the beginning of shame. Marcus still looked defiant, his arm around her shoulders, as if to remind her whose side she should be on. Mr. Morgan, Charlotte began, why did you choose to live as you do now, after your distinguished career? I took a deep breath. When my wife died, I lost my North Star. Sarah had been with me through everything, the triumphs and the failures, the long nights preparing for trials, the weight of holding people's lives in my hands. Without her, I couldn't bear to continue. I needed quiet. I needed to remember who I was apart from my career, apart from the accolades. And your relationship with your daughter during this time? I withdrew from everyone, including Emily. It wasn't fair to her, and for that I'm sorry, but it wasn't evidence of incapacity. It was grief. Parker stood for his cross-examination. Mr. Morgan, regardless of your past accomplishments or your reasons for withdrawal, do you honestly believe that at your age, with your deliberate disconnection from modern society, you are equipped to manage a substantial estate, including property investments and significant liquid assets? I looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Parker, I don't have to prove that I'm worthy of my brother's legacy. You have to prove that I'm not. And so far, all you've established is that I prefer simplicity to luxury, solitude to social climbing, and that I've chosen to spend my retirement years on my own terms rather than anyone else's. If that's the standard for incompetence, then I suggest we're going to need much larger guardianship facilities. A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. Even Baldwin smiled briefly before composing himself. Parker persisted. Let's test your acumen then. If you were to inherit a property worth $800,000 in today's market, what would be your approach to maximizing its value while minimizing your tax liability? I could see his strategy try to trip me up on technical details to prove I was out of touch. What he didn't know was that I had spent decades dealing with exactly these kinds of questions for my clients. First, I responded, I would evaluate whether the property should be held or sold based on market trends, location, and potential for appreciation. If held, I would consider placing it in a qualified personal residence trust to reduce estate tax implications. If sold, I would explore a 1031 exchange to defer capital gains tax by reinvesting in like-kind property. I would also consider the stepped-up basis rules applied to inherited property when calculating potential capital gains. Parker blinked clearly, not expecting such a detailed and technically accurate response. Furthermore, I continued, I would consult with a tax professional regarding the potential benefits of an irrevocable life insurance trust to provide liquidity for estate taxes without including the policy proceeds in the taxable estate, and I would examine whether a family limited partnership might be appropriate to facilitate management of the assets while potentially qualifying for valuation discounts for gift and estate tax purposes. The courtroom was silent. Even Charlotte looked impressed. She knew I was knowledgeable, but perhaps hadn't expected me to be quite so current. I may live simply Mr. Parker, I concluded, but that doesn't mean I've stopped thinking. It doesn't mean I've stopped learning. Parker had no further questions. In his closing argument, he tried to salvage his case, emphasizing my age, my withdrawal from society, my unconventional choices. But his words lacked conviction now. The narrative of the confused old man had crumbled in the face of reality. Charlotte's closing was brief and powerful. Your Honor, the petition before you today is not about protecting William Morgan. It's about controlling him and the assets he stands to inherit. Mr. Morgan has demonstrated not just competence, but exceptional clarity of thought and purpose. He has chosen a life that some might not understand, but it is unquestionably his choice to make. Baldwin didn't even leave the bench to deliberate. Having heard the evidence and testimony presented today, I find that the petitioners have failed to establish that William Morgan lacks the capacity to manage his affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied. Mr. Morgan remains in full control of his person and property, including any inheritance from his late brother. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound of finality. I had won. My autonomy, my dignity, my right to live as I chose, all affirmed by the court. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Emily approached me, Marcus trailing behind her. "Pop," she began, her voice uncertain, "I didn't know about your career, about who you were." I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised, who had been so ready to declare me incompetent, to take away my autonomy for her own gain. I felt a complex mixture of love, disappointment, and weariness. Would it have made a difference, Emily, if I had been a famous lawyer instead of just your father? Would you have treated me with more respect? She had no answer to that. Marcus put his hand on her arm. "We should go," he said quietly. "The lawyers can sort out the details." I watched them leave, feeling a profound sadness. This victory was hollow, without reconciliation, without understanding. But some bridges once broken take time to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. Charlotte stood beside me. "What will you do now, Will, with Thomas's estate?" I thought about Thomas, about our shared dreams and values, about the conversations we'd had over the years. "Something worthwhile," I said. "Something that would have made him proud." As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt a strange sense of rebirth. For 5 years, I had been hidden away, a shadow of my former self. Now, reluctantly, but perhaps necessarily, I had stepped back into the light. I didn't yet know what the future held, but for the first time since Sarah's death, I felt a sense of purpose stirring within me. Thomas had left me more than property and money. He had left me one final case to argue, not in a courtroom, but in the court of my own conscience. A case about legacy, about meaning, about what truly matters in the end. And this was one case I could not afford to lose. After the courtroom victory, I returned to my farmhouse in the countryside, but something had changed. The quiet that had once been a comfort now felt hollow. The walls that had sheltered me in my grief now seemed to be closing in. My brother was gone. My daughter was estranged, and I was left with a legacy I hadn't sought and a purpose I hadn't yet found. Charlotte drove me home that evening. We sat on my porch, watching the sunset, two old warriors who had won one last battle together. "What will you do with Thomas's estate?" she asked again, nursing a glass of my homemade lemonade. I stared at the horizon where the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. "I honestly don't know yet. I need to see what he left, really understand it." "You have time now," Charlotte said. "The court's ruling gives you full control. No one can challenge that." "Emily will never forgive me," I said quietly. "I humiliated her in that courtroom." Charlotte's expression hardened. "She was trying to have you declared incompetent, Will. She and that husband of hers were going to take everything from you. She's still my daughter. And you're still her father, but that didn't stop her." We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Charlotte stood to leave. "Let me know when you want to go through Thomas's papers. I'll come with you." "Thank you," I said, "for everything." She smiled, a gentle expression that softened the lines on her face. "It's good to have you back, Will." The world needs more guardians. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I would start going through Thomas's affairs today. I needed to understand what my brother had left me and why. I drove to Atlanta alone, following Charlotte's directions to the law firm handling Thomas's estate. The managing partner, Richard Coleman, greeted me with the deference one might show to a returning legend. "Mr. Morgan," he said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to meet you. I followed your career when I was in law school. Your argument in the Westfield case is still taught at Emory." I accepted his handshake with an awkward nod. I hadn't thought about the Westfield case in decades. Coleman led me to a conference room where several boxes of documents awaited. "These are your brother's personal papers," he explained. "His will was straightforward. Everything goes to you, but he left specific instructions that you should review these materials personally." I spent the entire day in that conference room going through Thomas's life. Financial records showed a shrewdly managed portfolio. Property deeds revealed his real estate holdings, including the large parcel outside Atlanta that Emily had mentioned. There were photographs too, Thomas and me as boys, as young men starting our careers at my wedding to Sarah, at his own wedding to a woman who had left him after just 3 years. But it was a sealed envelope marked "For Will Private" that caught my attention most. Inside was a handwritten letter dated just 6 months before his death. "Dear Will, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next. I hope it involves good bourbon and better company. I'm leaving everything to you, little brother. Not because you need it, we both know you've never cared much for material things, but because I trust you to do the right thing with it. Remember that conversation we had back in '78? We were young, idealistic, convinced we could change the world with law books and righteous indignation. We talked about founding a legal aid center, a place where the powerless could find champions. You went on to become the guardian, taking on impossible cases one at a time. I took the corporate path, making money, but always feeling I'd left something important behind. Maybe it's not too late. Maybe what I couldn't do in life, I can help accomplish in death. Use what I've left you, Will. Build something that matters. Something that would have made us both proud. Your brother always, Thomas." I read the letter 3 times, my vision blurring with tears. I remembered that night in 1978 perfectly. We were in Thomas's apartment celebrating my first major trial victory, talking about justice and equality and all the idealistic dreams of young men who haven't yet been beaten down by the world. I carefully folded the letter and put it in my pocket. The rest of Thomas's papers suddenly seemed less important. I had my answer now. I knew what I needed to do. Over the next week, Charlotte helped me navigate the legal processes of assuming control of Thomas's estate. The property outside Atlanta was even more valuable than I'd thought, nearly $950,000 in the current market. The investment portfolio added another $700,000. Thomas had lived well, but within his means, and he'd been an excellent financial manager. "So," Charlotte said as we reviewed the final inventory about this legal aid center. I looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" She smiled. "Thomas mentioned it to me once years ago, said it was a dream you two had shared." I'd forgotten about it, I admitted, or maybe I just pushed it aside. Life gets in the way of dreams sometimes. And sometimes life gives you a second chance at them. I nodded slowly. The property would be perfect for it, close enough to the city to be accessible, but not so expensive that we'd be wasting resources on rent. We could build something modest but functional. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "I'll need help," I said, "a lot of it." "Count me in," she replied without hesitation. "I've been thinking about scaling back my practice anyway, spending more time on pro bono work." "I'll need to reach out to others," I said, my mind already racing with possibilities. "Kevin Harris for sure. He has connections with the State Bar Association, and Judge Baldwin James. He might be interested in teaching clinics. Sounds like you're building a dream team." "I'm trying to build a legacy," I corrected. "Not mine. Ours, Thomas's and mine." Over the next month, the Thomas Morgan Justice Center began to take shape, first on paper, then in reality. I sold my farmhouse, not without a pang of regret, and moved into a small apartment in Atlanta to be closer to the project. I didn't need much space, and I wanted to put as much of my own money into the center as possible to match what Thomas had provided. The property was beautiful, 10 acres of gently rolling land with a small creek running through it. The existing structure, a former corporate retreat, would need renovation, but had good bones. I worked with architects to design a space that would include offices for staff attorneys, meeting rooms for clients, a law library, and classrooms for legal clinics. Charlotte was as good as her word, reducing her private practice to part-time so she could serve as the center's first executive director. Kevin Harris agreed to chair the board of directors, bringing his prestige and connections. And to my surprise and gratification, James Baldwin volunteered to lead our education programs, teaching young lawyers the art of criminal defense. One by one, our other former colleagues emerged from the woodwork when they heard what we were building. Prosecutors I'd faced across courtrooms, judges before, whom I'd argued cases, defense attorneys who had been inspired by my work, all offering support, expertise, resources. Construction began in early summer. I visited the site daily, watching as the vision became reality. Workers tore down walls and built new ones, installed wiring and plumbing, transformed the dated corporate retreat into a modern legal center. I often brought lunch for the construction crew, sitting with them during breaks, learning about their lives and families. They started calling me counselor, a title I hadn't heard in years. One afternoon in late July, I was at the site reviewing plans with the contractor when a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Emily, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen or spoken to her since the courtroom. She stepped out of her car, elegant as always in her tailored suit, but there was something different about her. A hesitancy in her movements, a shadow in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Hello, Pop," she said, her voice uncertain. "Emily." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't hard. Everyone's talking about what you're doing here." She looked around at the half-finished building. "The Thomas Morgan Justice Center. It's all over the legal community. Would you like to see it?" I offered, not sure what else to say. She nodded, and I led her through the construction site, explaining our plans, our mission, the people who had joined the cause. She listened without commenting, her face unreadable. "Why are you here, Emily?" I finally asked as we stood looking out over the creek. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Marcus and I are separating." I wasn't entirely surprised. Their marriage had always seemed more like a business partnership than a love match. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. No matter what she had done, she was still my daughter, and I didn't want her to suffer. "Don't be," she replied. "It's been a long time coming. The hearing, what happened there, it just brought things to a head." "How so?" She turned to face me directly. "He was using me, Pop. Using my name, my connections in the legal community. I knew it on some level, but I didn't want to see it. Then when all those people testified about you, about your reputation, your legacy, I realized I never really knew you. And Marcus, all he could talk about afterward was the money we'd lost. Not what we'd done to you, not what we'd tried to do to my own father." Her voice broke on the last words. I wanted to reach out to her to offer comfort, but the wound between us was still too fresh, too deep. "I never wanted you to know that part of my life," I said instead. "I wanted to protect you from it." "From what?" "From knowing my father was respected, admired, that he'd helped people save lives." "From the darkness," I said quietly. "From the weight of holding someone else's fate in your hands. From the knowledge that the system is broken, and the best you can do is fight for small victories in an endless war." She was silent for a moment, absorbing this. "I've been thinking a lot," she finally said, "about why I became a lawyer in the first place. It wasn't for justice. It was for status, for money. I lost my way somewhere." "We all do sometimes," I said. "The important thing is finding it again." She nodded, then looked at her watch. "I should go. I have a meeting." "Of course." She took a few steps toward her car, then turned back. "Would it be all right if I came back sometime to see how the center is progressing?" "Anytime," I said. "It's your uncle's legacy, too." She gave me a small, sad smile and left. I watched her car disappear down the driveway, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. The next day, I met with Charlotte and Kevin to discuss the center's legal structure and mission statement. We were deep in conversation about 501c3 status when my phone rang. It was the contractor, his voice urgent. "Mr. Morgan, you need to get down here right away. There's been a problem." I arrived at the construction site to find police cars and a fire truck in the driveway. The contractor, Mike Simmons, met me with a grim expression. "Someone broke in last night," he explained. "Vandalized the place." Spray-painted graffiti on the walls smashed some of the new windows. Was anything stolen? I asked, surveying the damage. That's the strange thing. They didn't take any of the tools or equipment. This wasn't a robbery, it was targeted. I followed him inside where a police officer was taking photographs of the damage. The graffiti on the main wall sent a chill through me. "Stay away, Guardian, last warning." The officer looked up as I entered. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Officer Reynolds. Can you think of anyone who might have a grudge against you or this project?" I could think of several possibilities. In my years as a defense attorney, I'd made enemies prosecutors who resented my success, families of victims who blamed me for defending the accused clients who felt I hadn't done enough to help them. But most of those were decades in the past. Who would harbor such a grudge after all this time? "I'll need to think about it," I told the officer. "My career made me some enemies." "Well, someone doesn't want this center to open," he said, nodding at the graffiti, "and they're willing to commit crimes to stop it." After the police left promising to increase patrols in the area, I sat alone in what would eventually be my office, surrounded by the evidence of someone's hatred. Broken glass crunched under my feet as I walked to the window, looking out at the land that had been meant to be a place of hope and justice. "Will," Charlotte's voice came from the doorway. "Kevin called me. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, not turning around. "Just thinking. About who did this. About whether to go forward." I turned to face her. If someone's willing to do this now, what might they do once we're open? I can't put staff at risk. I can't put clients at risk. Charlotte's expression hardened. "William Morgan, if you think for 1 second that we're going to let some coward with a spray can stop us, then you've forgotten who we are." "Who you are." "I'm an old man, Charlotte." "You're the guardian," she shot back. "And guardians don't quit when things get hard. They fight harder." She was right, of course. I'd faced worse than vandalism in my career. I'd received death threats during high-profile cases, had my car windows smashed, been followed home by angry supporters of people I'd prosecuted or defended against. This was just another attempt at intimidation. "We'll need security," I conceded. "Cameras, alarm systems, maybe even a guard at first." "Already on it," Charlotte said. "Kevin's calling in a favor with a security firm. They'll be here tomorrow to install everything." "You know me too well." She smiled. "I know you well enough to know you weren't really considering quitting. You just needed someone to argue with." The vandalism incident had an unexpected consequence. It brought attention to our project. Local news covered the story, interviewing me about the center and its mission. Former clients came forward offering support. Law students from Emory and Georgia State volunteered to help with cleanup and repairs. And 3 days after the incident, Emily showed up again, this time in jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "I heard what happened," she said simply. "I came to help." She stayed all day working alongside volunteers to clean up broken glass and paint over graffiti. She didn't say much, and I didn't press her, but I noticed her watching me as I spoke with volunteers, as I thanked people for their help, as I outlined our vision for the center to a group of law students. That evening, as the volunteers were leaving, she approached me. "You're different here," she said. "Different how? More alive. At the farm, you always seemed, I don't know, faded somehow, like a photograph that's been left in the sun too long." I nodded slowly. I was fading, by choice. After your mother died, I couldn't bear to be the person I'd been. It hurt too much. And now I have a purpose again. She looked out at the center, at the people leaving, at the progress we'd made in just one day. "I'd like to be part of it," she said quietly. "If you'll have me." I studied my daughter's face, searching for signs of the coldness, the calculation I'd seen before. But all I saw was uncertainty, hope, and a hint of the little girl who had once looked at me with unconditional love. "We could use another attorney," I said carefully, "especially one with corporate law experience. There will be contracts to review, partnerships to negotiate." "I'd have to keep my day job," she said, "at least for now, but I could volunteer evenings, weekends." "That would be more than enough." She nodded, and something like peace settled between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Construction continued at a rapid pace, accelerated by the outpouring of community support after the vandalism. Security cameras were installed, monitored by a service that would alert police to any intrusions. Furniture was delivered, computers set up a law library, established with donations from local firms. Emily became a regular presence, coming by after work and on weekends as promised. She had a good eye for detail, catching things in contracts that others missed, suggesting efficient systems for client intake and case management. Gradually, the awkwardness between us began to ease, replaced by a cautious, professional respect. One evening, as we were reviewing applications for staff attorney positions, she asked about her mother. "Did Mom know about your work, your reputation?" "She knew everything," I said. "She was my partner in all of it. She edited my briefs, listened to my arguments, celebrated the victories, and comforted me through the defeats." "She never told me," Emily said wonderingly. "All those years, and she never said a word about the Guardian." "We both wanted to protect you from that world. We wanted you to have a normal childhood, not one defined by your father's cases." But after I became a lawyer myself, by then the habit of separation was set, I explained. And to be honest, I wasn't sure you'd understand or approve of my approach. You went into corporate law focused on the letter of the law rather than its spirit. I defended people society had already condemned. We were on very different paths. She was quiet for a moment. "I wish I had known," she finally said. "Maybe I would have made different choices. Maybe, but we can't change the past. We can only move forward." 2 months after the vandalism with the center's grand opening, just weeks away, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working late finalizing plans for our first community legal clinic when there was a knock at my office door. "Come in," I called, expecting Charlotte or perhaps Emily. Instead, a tall man in his 60s entered. He was expensively dressed with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to power. I recognized him immediately. District Attorney Howard Mitchell, my most frequent adversary during my years in practice. "Hello, Will," he said, his voice just as resonant as I remembered. "It's been a long time." I stood to shake his hand. "Howard, this is a surprise." "I imagine it is." He looked around my office with interest. "Impressive operation you were building here." "Thank you. Would you like to sit down?" He took the offered chair, studying me with shrewd eyes. "I heard you were back in the game. Had to see for myself." "Not back in the game exactly," I corrected. "Just trying to make a difference in a different way." He nodded. "Legal aid, pro bono work, training young lawyers. Very noble." There was something in his tone that put me on alert. Howard Mitchell had never appreciated my work as a defense attorney. He'd seen me as an obstacle to justice rather than its advocate. Our courtroom battles had been legendary, and while there had been professional respect, there had never been friendship. "What brings you here, Howard?" I asked directly. "Concern," he said, equally direct. "Concern about the kind of operation you're setting up and the message it sends." "And what message would that be?" "That the system is broken, that prosecutors are the enemy, that criminals deserve more protection than their victims." I leaned back in my chair, considering my response carefully. "Is that what you think we're doing here? Isn't it the Guardian returns to champion the accused once more? We're providing legal representation to people who can't afford it," I said evenly, "making sure the system works as it's supposed to with equal justice under law. I would think as a prosecutor committed to justice, you'd appreciate that." "What I appreciate," Mitchell said, his voice hardening, "is law and order. What I appreciate is victims seeing their attackers held accountable. What I don't appreciate is a legal center whose mission seems to be making my job harder. Our mission is justice, Howard, same as it's always been." He stood abruptly. "Well, I've said my piece. I wanted you to know that my office will be watching this center very carefully. We won't tolerate any ethical violations, any borderline tactics, anything that crosses the line." I remained seated, keeping my expression neutral. "We'll hold ourselves to the highest ethical standards, as I always have, but we won't be intimidated from zealously representing our clients as is our duty under the law." Mitchell nodded curtly and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "One more thing, Will. There's a new bill in the state legislature, HB 157. It would place significant restrictions on legal aid organizations, especially those receiving any state funding." "We're privately funded," I pointed out. "For now, but you'll need grants eventually. Everyone does. And this bill would make those grants contingent on not representing certain types of defendants or bringing certain types of actions against the state." He smiled thinly. "Just something to think about." After he left, I sat motionless for a long time processing the implications of his visit. Was this a simple warning from an old adversary, or something more? Could Mitchell have been behind the vandalism? It seemed unlikely. He was too smart, too careful for such crude tactics. But his support of HB 157 was troubling. If passed, such a bill could severely limit our center's effectiveness. I called Charlotte immediately. "We need to look into HB 157, I told her, "and we need to do it quickly." Over the next week, we mobilized a response. Charlotte and I reviewed the proposed legislation in detail, identifying its most problematic provisions. Kevin Harris reached out to his contacts in the legislature, gauging support and opposition. Emily, to my surprise, volunteered to draft a position paper outlining the bill's constitutional vulnerabilities. "I know the corporate world," she explained. "I understand how these restrictive measures get packaged and sold. I can help fight this." We organized a coalition of legal aid organizations, law school clinics, and civil rights groups to oppose the bill. I gave interviews to local media explaining how such restrictions would harm the most vulnerable citizens. And then just 10 days before our grand opening, Emily came to my office with troubling news. "Marcus is involved with HB 157, she said without preamble. "He's been lobbying for it on behalf of a client." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What client?" "I don't know for sure, but I saw him having dinner with Howard Mitchell last night. They looked friendly." The pieces began to fall into place. Marcus's law firm, representing interests aligning with Mitchell's tough-on-crime agenda, using Emily's connection to me to gather intelligence, perhaps even planting the idea of declaring me incompetent to prevent the center from being established. "Do you think he knew," I asked, "about Thomas's letter, about what I planned to do with the inheritance?" Emily shook her head miserably. "I don't know. I might have mentioned something early on before the hearing. I didn't think it mattered then." I took a deep breath, trying to control my anger. This wasn't just about me anymore, or even about Emily. This was about the center, about the people it would help, about Thomas's legacy. "We need to move quickly," I said. "The grand opening is in 10 days. If they're going to try to stop us, it will be before then." "What can we do?" Emily asked. "Fight fire with fire," I replied, an idea forming. "You said Marcus is lobbying for a client. Who's the biggest donor to Mitchell's campaigns?" Emily thought for a moment. "Reynolds Construction. Old money, very conservative." "And who represents Reynolds?" "Hargrove and Bell, Marcus's firm." I nodded. "I think it's time the Guardian came out of retirement for one last case." The next day, I called a meeting with Charlotte, Kevin, James, Baldwin, and Emily. I laid out what we knew and what we suspected, that Marcus, working for Reynolds Construction through his firm, was collaborating with Mitchell to stop our center from opening, first through the incompetency hearing, then through vandalism, and now through legislation. "But why?" James asked. "What does Reynolds Construction care about a legal aid center?" "Because we're not just any legal aid center," I explained. "One of our planned focus areas is housing rights and tenant advocacy. Reynolds owns dozens of apartment complexes in low-income neighborhoods. They've been sued repeatedly for code violations, discriminatory practices, and illegal evictions. And they always settle quietly," Emily added, realization dawning. "Because they know if one of these cases ever went to trial with a good attorney with proper resources behind it, it could open the floodgates," I finished, "set precedents that would cost them millions." "So what's the plan?" Charlotte asked, always practical. "We go on offense," I said. "Emily, I need everything you have on Reynolds' properties, especially any internal documents you might have had access to through Marcus." She hesitated. "I signed confidentiality agreements." "I'm not asking you to violate those," I assured her, "but anything that was shared with you as Marcus's wife rather than as an attorney would be fair game." She nodded slowly. "There are some things. Conversations I overheard, documents I saw at the house." "Good. Kevin, I need you to reach out to your contacts at the State Bar Association. Find out who else has filed complaints against Reynolds, what happened to those cases." "On it," Kevin said. "James, you have friends in the media. We need to start getting the story out, not about us directly, but about Reynolds, about tenant rights, about the importance of legal representation for housing issues." "I know just who to call," James said. "And Charlotte," I turned to my oldest friend, "I need you to prepare for the possibility that we might have to file a major class action lawsuit very quickly." Against Reynolds, she asked. Against Reynolds, against the state, if HB 157 passes against anyone who tries to prevent citizens from accessing justice. I looked around at the determined faces surrounding me. They think we're just a small legal aid center. They need to remember who they're dealing with. Over the next week, we worked tirelessly. Emily provided crucial information about Reynolds' business practices, including a pattern of targeting elderly tenants for eviction when property values rose, allowing dangerous conditions to persist in buildings occupied primarily by minorities, and using intimidation tactics against tenants who complained. Kevin discovered that 17 complaints had been filed against Reynolds with the State Bar's Ethics Committee in the past 5 years, all dismissed under circumstances that warranted further investigation. James's media contacts began running stories about housing conditions in Reynolds-owned properties, featuring interviews with tenants who had been unable to find legal representation for their complaints. And Charlotte prepared what would become our first major case as a center, a class action lawsuit on behalf of over 200 current and former Reynolds tenants, alleging systematic violations of fair housing laws, building codes, and tenant rights. The Sunday before our grand opening, I was at the center early reviewing the final preparations. Everything was ready. The offices furnished the computers, installed the staff, hired the cases prepared. All we needed now was to open our doors. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Emily standing there looking troubled. "Pop," she said, "there's something you should know. Marcus called me last night." My guard went up immediately. "What did he want?" "To warn me," he said. "He told me to stay away from the opening tomorrow. He said things might get ugly." I felt a chill. "Did he elaborate?" She shook her head. "He wouldn't say more, just that I should keep my distance if I knew what was good for me." "You should take his advice," I said. "Stay away tomorrow. We don't know what they're planning." "No," Emily said firmly. "I'm not hiding. This center is part of my legacy too. Uncle Thomas's niece, your daughter. I belong here." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I'd missed before: a strength, a determination that reminded me of Sarah and of myself. "All right," I said, "but stay close to me or Charlotte." The morning of the grand opening dawned clear and bright. We had arranged for a small ceremony, a ribbon cutting, some brief remarks, a tour of the facilities for community members and the press. Charlotte had insisted on a security detail which now patrolled the perimeter of the property. As I stood at the podium looking out at the gathered crowd, colleagues, supporters, potential clients, reporters, I felt a surge of pride and purpose. This was what Thomas had wanted, what we had both wanted all those years ago. "Welcome to the Thomas Morgan Justice Center," I began. "My brother believed, as I believe, that justice is not a privilege for the few but a right for all. This center exists to help make that ideal a reality." And as I spoke, I noticed movement at the back of the crowd. Howard Mitchell had arrived accompanied by several men in suits. One of them was Marcus. Their expressions were grim, determined. I continued my speech, trying to focus on the faces of friends and supporters rather than the threat looming at the edges. "Today, we open our doors to anyone who needs legal help but cannot afford it. We make a promise that in this place, the scales of justice will be balanced not by wealth or power, but by truth and principle." Mitchell was moving through the crowd now, heading toward the podium. I could see papers in his hand, documents of some kind. Behind him, uniformed officers were appearing at the edges of the gathering. "In honor of my brother, in memory of all those who fought for justice before us, and in hope for those who will continue the fight after we're gone, I declare the Thomas Morgan Justice Center officially open." I cut the ribbon to applause from the crowd. As I stepped back from the podium, Mitchell reached the front, flanked by officers. "William Morgan," he announced loudly, "I have here a court order temporarily suspending operation of this center pending investigation of multiple regulatory violations." A murmur ran through the crowd. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing. "What violations?" Charlotte demanded, stepping forward. Mitchell smiled thinly. "Improper filing of 501c3 documents, failure to obtain proper permits, potential violations of legal ethics rules regarding client solicitation." The list goes on. I took the papers he offered, scanning them quickly. The order was signed by Judge Raymond Davis, a close ally of Mitchell's and a notorious hardliner. "This is harassment, Howard," I said quietly. "You know it, and I know it. It's the law, Will, he replied. Something you used to respect. Before I could respond, there was a commotion at the back of the crowd. People were parting to allow someone through. A tall, distinguished man in judicial robes walked purposefully toward us. Your Honor, Mitchell said, surprised. I didn't expect to see you here. State Supreme Court Justice Kevin Harris nodded coolly. Evidently not district attorney. May I see those papers? Mitchell handed over the court order, looking less confident now. Kevin reviewed the documents, his expression growing darker. This order, he said finally, is procedurally deficient in multiple ways. Judge Davis lacks jurisdiction over several of the claims. The evidence cited is speculative at best. And most importantly, he looked up, fixing Mitchell with a stern gaze. It represents a potential abuse of the legal process for political purposes. With all due respect, Justice Harris, you don't have the authority to— I'm well aware of my authority, Mr. Mitchell, Kevin interrupted. And while I cannot unilaterally vacate another judge's order, I can and will refer this matter to the Judicial Qualifications Commission for review. In the meantime, he turned to me, I suggest you proceed with your opening as planned, Mr. Morgan. Comply with the portions of the order regarding client intake if you wish, but the center itself can certainly continue preparations to serve the community. Mitchell's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, Morgan, he said quietly. Not by a long shot. It never is with you, Howard, I replied. But remember, I won the majority of our courtroom battles. I'd think carefully before starting a new one. He stalked away, the officers following uncertainly. Marcus lingered for a moment, his eyes finding Emily in the crowd. She stared back at him, her expression resolute. After a moment, he turned and followed Mitchell. The crowd, which had watched this confrontation in stunned silence, burst into applause as Mitchell and his entourage departed. Reporters swarmed forward, shouting questions. Kevin raised a hand for silence. The Thomas Morgan Justice Center represents the highest ideals of our legal profession, he announced. Attempts to interfere with its mission through procedural maneuvering will not succeed. Justice will prevail. More applause, cameras flashed. The opening continued. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and we were alone in what was now my office, I thanked Kevin for his intervention. You took a risk, I said. Davis has friends on the bench. Kevin shrugged. So do I. And more importantly, so do you. The legal community hasn't forgotten the guardian will. Your enemies remember, but so do your friends. Charlotte, who had been reviewing the court order in detail, looked up. Most of these claims are baseless. We can have them dismissed within weeks. The damage would have been done by then, I pointed out. First impressions matter. If we'd had to turn people away on our opening day. But we didn't, Emily said, her voice strong and clear. We're open. We're here, and thanks to Mitchell's stunt, we now have more publicity than we could have ever hoped for. I looked at my daughter with newfound respect. You're right. Sometimes our enemies do our work for us. As evening fell, I stood alone on the porch of the newly opened center, watching the sunset just as I used to do from my farmhouse. But now, instead of emptiness and silence, I felt purpose and community. Emily joined me, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She offered me one and leaned against the railing beside me. What are you thinking, Pop? She asked. I'm thinking about your Uncle Thomas, I said truthfully, about whether he'd be proud of what we've built here. I think he would be, she said. I wish I'd known him better. He would have liked the woman you're becoming, I told her. Not the corporate lawyer married to Marcus, but this person, the one who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. She was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. I'm sorry, she finally said, for everything. For the hearing, for trying to take your autonomy, for not seeing who you really are. I never showed you who I really was, I reminded her. I kept that part of myself hidden. Still, she insisted, I should have known better, should have trusted you more. I put my arm around her shoulders, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just months ago. We all make mistakes, Emily. What matters is what we do afterward. She leaned against me slightly, not entirely comfortable yet, but willing to try. What happens now with Mitchell, with the center, with everything? I gazed out at the land that had once belonged to Thomas and now belonged to a greater purpose. Now, I said, we do what the Guardian always did. We fight one case at a time, one client at a time, one injustice at a time. And Reynolds Construction, I smiled slightly. They'll be getting some official visitors very soon. The reporting James arranged has attracted attention from state regulators, And our class action will proceed as planned. Marcus won't like that. Marcus made his choice, I said, just as you've made yours. As darkness fell, lights came on automatically around the property, illuminating the sign that bore Thomas's name. In the distance, I could see cars on the highway, people going about their lives unaware that here in this place, a group of determined individuals had committed themselves to fighting for justice on their behalf. He would be proud, I said, again more to myself than to Emily. Thomas would be proud. And for the first time since my brother's death, I felt at peace. In the months that followed our tumultuous opening, the Thomas Morgan Justice Center found its rhythm. Despite Howard Mitchell's initial attempts to shut us down, we prevailed in court with Judge Baldwin dismissing all of the manufactured violations. The publicity surrounding the attempted closure only strengthened our position in the community, bringing in more clients, more volunteers, and more donations than we'd initially anticipated. I established a routine arriving early each morning, reviewing cases with our staff attorneys, meeting with clients, and teaching seminars for law students who volunteered their time. For the first time since Sarah died, I felt truly alive, engaged with the world and its problems, making a difference in ways both small and large. Charlotte ran the administrative side of the center with her characteristic efficiency, ensuring we remain financially stable and operationally sound. The class action lawsuit against Reynolds Construction was proceeding steadily through the discovery phase, each new document revealing more extensive violations than we had initially suspected. Emily continued to volunteer evenings and weekends, gradually taking on more responsibility. She had a particular talent for interviewing clients, drawing out crucial details that others missed. I recognized in her the same instinct for truth that had guided my own career, though I was careful not to mention it. Our relationship remained delicate healing, but not yet healed. One crisp autumn morning, I arrived at the center to find Charlotte waiting in my office, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down my coffee. She pushed a newspaper across the desk. Page 3. I opened the paper to find a small article that made my heart sink. Marcus Hayes had been appointed as a special advisor to the State Attorney General's office, focusing on reform of legal aid programs. "This is about us," I said, looking up at Charlotte. "Without question, Mitchell couldn't shut us down directly, so he's taking a different approach." I nodded slowly. "Legislative, regulatory, death by 1,000 cuts. What do we do?" I considered our options. Direct confrontation would play into their hands, making us appear politically motivated rather than focused on client service. Ignoring the threat could allow harmful policies to take root. We continue our work, I decided, but we also prepare. Emily might have insights into Marcus's strategies, and we should reach out to other legal aid organizations, form a coalition. Charlotte nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else. A man came by yesterday after you'd left. He wouldn't leave his name, but he said he needed to speak with you personally. Something about an old case." "Did he say which case?" "No, just that it was from 30 years ago and that lives depended on it." My mind raced through the major cases from that period. There had been so many, each with its own complexities, its own cast of characters, its own consequences. Without more information, I couldn't even begin to guess. "If he comes back, call me immediately," I said. 2 days later, I was reviewing a tenant's lease when Charlotte appeared at my office door. "He's back," she said quietly, "the man who wouldn't leave his name." I nodded, set the lease aside, and straightened my tie. "Send him in." The man who entered was in his 60s, thin and gray-haired, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years outdoors. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants, both clean but worn. His eyes, however, were sharp and assessing as they took in my office, my bookshelves, and finally me. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice gravelly, "I wasn't sure you'd see me." "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," I replied, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. "You know who I am, but I don't know you." He sat his movements careful as if his joints pained him. "My name is Frank Talbot. 30 years ago, you defended my brother Richard on a murder charge." The name sparked immediate recognition. Richard Talbot, accused of killing his business partner, Edward Chambers. The evidence had been circumstantial, but damning a history of arguments, financial problems, Talbot's fingerprints on the murder weapon. It had been one of my most challenging cases, requiring months of investigation to uncover the truth that Chambers had been killed by a loan shark to whom he'd owed substantial gambling debts. I'd managed to find a witness who had seen the actual killer leaving Chambers' office, leading to Talbot's acquittal. I remember, I said. Richard was innocent. We proved it. Frank nodded, a flash of pain crossing his face. Richard died last month. Lung cancer. I'm sorry to hear that. Before he died, he told me something. Frank leaned forward, lowering his voice. Something he'd never told anyone, not even you. A sense of unease crept over me. What was that? He was there that night. Not when Chambers was killed. That really was the loan shark, just like you proved. But Richard went to the office afterward, saw Chambers' body, panicked, and ran. That's why his fingerprints were on the murder weapon. He picked it up, then dropped it when he realized what he was holding. I sat back, absorbing this new information. It didn't change the fundamental truth: Richard hadn't killed Chambers, but it did explain some of the evidence that had been harder to reconcile. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Frank reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Because of this, Richard received it 2 weeks before he died. I took the paper and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, the script neat but somehow menacing. I know what you did. I know what your lawyer helped cover up. Time for justice. Did Richard know who sent this? Frank shook his head. No, but it terrified him. He thought someone was going to try to reopen the case, accuse you of misconduct. There was no misconduct, I said firmly. Richard never told me he was at the scene, but even if he had, it wouldn't have changed my defense. He didn't kill Chambers. I believe you, Frank said, but someone else might not. Richard was worried about your reputation. He felt he owed you for saving his life. I studied the note again. Has anyone else contacted you about this? No, but... Frank hesitated. The night before Richard died, someone broke into his house. Nothing was taken, but his office was searched. His case files were disturbed. My concern deepened. This wasn't just about a 30-year-old case. Someone was actively investigating, searching for something specific. Mr. Talbot, I said carefully, I need you to think. Did Richard ever mention anything unusual about Chambers' business? Any clients or partners who might still have reason to be concerned about the case? Frank frowned in concentration. He didn't talk about it much. The whole experience was traumatic for him, but there was something. He closed his eyes, trying to remember. About 2 years ago, when that big real estate development was announced downtown, the Hamilton Project. Richard saw the news and got agitated, said something like, "It's all connected." Always was. The Hamilton Project, a massive controversial development backed by some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the state. Construction had begun earlier this year after lengthy battles over zoning, environmental concerns, and displaced residents. Did he elaborate? No, I asked, but he just clammed up, said it was better not to know. I made a quick decision. Mr. Talbot, may I keep this note? And would you be willing to write down everything you can remember about your conversations with Richard regarding Chambers, especially anything related to the Hamilton Project? Frank agreed readily, seeming relieved to share the burden. After he left, I sat for a long time staring at the threatening note, trying to connect threads that had been severed decades ago. Finally, I picked up the phone and called Kevin Harris. Kevin, I need access to the court records from the Richard Talbot case, 1992, and anything you can find about the financial backers of the Hamilton Project. That evening, I shared my concerns with Charlotte and Emily, who had stayed late to work on the Reynolds case. You think there's a connection between Chambers' murder 30 years ago and the Hamilton Project? Charlotte asked, skeptical. I think Richard Talbot thought there was, I said, and someone thought it was important enough to threaten him and search his house. Emily had been listening quietly, her legal mind analyzing the possibilities. The Hamilton Project involves hundreds of millions in investment, she said. The primary developer is Hamilton Enterprises, but they're backed by a consortium including, she frowned, trying to remember, Westfield Development, Reynolds Construction, and several other major players. Reynolds, Charlotte, and I exchanged a glance. Yes, Emily confirmed. Marcus mentioned it once. Reynolds has a 15% stake. And Mitchell has been targeting us from the beginning, I mused. First through the incompetency hearing, then the vandalism, then the regulatory challenges. You think Mitchell is connected to Chambers' murder? Charlotte sounded incredulous. No, I said slowly, but I think he might be connected to whatever Chambers was involved in, whatever made Richard Talbot say it's all connected. The next day, I received a call from Kevin. He'd arranged for me to access the Talbot case files, which had been archived in the state court repository. He'd also found something interesting about the Hamilton project. The land where they're building was owned by a series of shell companies before Hamilton Enterprises acquired it, he told me. I tracked the ownership back through public records. Guess who owned a controlling interest in those companies in the early 90s? Edward Chambers, I guessed. Close. Chambers and Associates, his investment firm. After his death, the ownership became murky. The firm was dissolved, assets sold off. But somehow those particular properties ended up being held by entities that eventually sold to Hamilton. At what price? That's the interesting part, far below market value, almost as if it was predetermined. The picture was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. Chambers had owned land that decades later became immensely valuable as part of the Hamilton project. After his death, that land had been channeled through a series of transactions that obscured its origin but maintained its destination. Kevin, I said, who oversees the state records for corporate filings from that period? That would be the Secretary of State's office, corporate division. And who was deputy secretary in charge of that division in the early 90s? There was a pause as Kevin made the connection. Howard Mitchell, before he became a prosecutor. Exactly. The case files revealed little I didn't already know, but reviewing them brought back vivid memories. I had been younger then, more aggressive perhaps, but just as committed to finding the truth. The prosecution's case had hinged on Richard's fingerprints on the murder weapon and his financial disputes with Chambers. Our breakthrough had come from a night security guard who testified to seeing another man later identified as a known associate of a loan shark leaving the building around the time of the murder. What the files didn't show was the behind-the-scenes struggle, the resistant witnesses, the evidence that was difficult to access the judge, who seemed predisposed to believe in Richard's guilt. I had overcome those obstacles, but it had been a near thing. As I was preparing to leave the repository, a clerk approached with a small, sealed envelope. This was included with the files marked for your attention only. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Chambers knew about the land deal. That's why he died. Others knew too. Some still do. Be careful, Guardian. No signature, no indication of who had left it. But the message was clear. I was poking into dangerous territory. Back at the center, I found Emily waiting in my office. I've been going through the Reynolds discovery materials, she said without preamble. There's a connection to the Hamilton project. Reynolds is using the same contractors, the same suppliers, even some of the same financial structures as Hamilton Enterprises. How deep does it go? Deep enough that if Reynolds falls, it could destabilize the entire project. And if what you suspect is true, that there's some kind of decades-long fraud or conspiracy involving that land, then a lot of powerful people stand to lose a lot of money. And to protect that money, they'd be willing to do almost anything, I finished, including targeting our center, which represents the biggest legal threat to Reynolds. Emily nodded grimly. Marcus isn't just working for the Attorney General as a legal advisor. He's protecting specific interests. His own included, I pointed out. If he still has financial ties to his old firm and they represent Reynolds. He does, Emily confirmed. It was part of our separation agreement. He kept his partnership interest. We were interrupted by a call from Charlotte. Will you need to get down here right away? There's been another break-in. This time the damage was more targeted. The intruders had bypassed the security system professionally, according to the police, and gone straight for our case files. The Reynolds litigation materials were untouched, probably because they knew those would be too well protected, but older files had been rifled through and our computer system had been accessed. They were looking for anything related to Chambers or the Talbot case, I told Charlotte as we surveyed the damage. They know we're making connections. And now they know, Anya, she replied. What's our next move? I thought for a moment. We go public, not with accusations we can't prove, but with the Reynolds case. We accelerate the litigation file for class certification now instead of waiting. That's risky. We're still gathering evidence. We have enough, and more importantly, it puts them on the defensive. If they're busy fighting the lawsuit, they'll have less time to come after us directly. Charlotte didn't look convinced, but she trusted my instincts. I'll start preparing the motion. That night, I worked late alone in my office trying to piece together the full picture. Chambers had owned land that later became part of the Hamilton Project. He had been killed ostensibly by a loan shark, but possibly because he knew about the land deal. Mitchell had been in a position to facilitate the obscure transfers of property after Chambers' death. Now, decades later, that land was worth hundreds of millions, and our legal center represented a threat to the entire house of cards. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't hear the office door open. It was only when a shadow fell across my desk that I looked up to see Howard Mitchell standing there. "Working late guardian," he said, using my old title with a hint of mockery. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "What brings you here, Howard?" "More regulatory violations to invent." He smiled thinly and sat down uninvited. "I thought it was time we had a frank conversation. Man to man, off the record. About, about the direction your center is taking, this crusade against Reynolds construction, the digging into ancient history." So he knew about our investigation into Chambers and the Talbot case. That confirmed our suspicions about the break-in. "It's interesting you should mention ancient history," I said carefully. "I've been reminiscing myself lately about old cases, old land deals, old friends and enemies." Mitchell's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Nostalgia is a luxury for old men, Will. The future is what matters. And your future, this center's future, depends on the choices you make now." "Are you threatening me, Howard?" "I'm offering you wisdom. There are powerful forces at work here, forces that have been in motion for decades. The Hamilton Project represents progress, jobs, economic growth. It's bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than petty grievances from the past." "Justice isn't a petty grievance," I said, anger rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "If crimes were committed, alleged crimes," he interrupted, "from 30 years ago, unprovable, even if they happened as you imagine, the statute of limitations has long expired. Not for murder, and not for ongoing conspiracy." For the first time, Mitchell's composure slipped. A flash of something fear-anger crossed his face before he controlled it. "You always were relentless," he said, his voice lower now. "It made you a formidable opponent in court. But this isn't a courtroom, Will. This is real life with real consequences. People could get hurt." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. People like Frank Talbot or Richard before his convenient death from cancer. Mitchell stood adjusting his expensive suit. "I didn't come here to argue. I came to offer you a proposition. Drop the Reynolds case. Cease this historical research project. In return, the legislative pressure will ease. The regulatory challenges will disappear. Your center can continue its work helping individual clients with their small problems. And if I refuse," he shrugged the gesture, almost elegant in its dismissiveness, "then I can't be responsible for what happens next, to the center or to those you care about." After he left, I sat in the darkened office for a long time. Mitchell's visit had confirmed our worst suspicions, but it had also escalated the danger. This was no longer just about the center or even about Reynolds construction. We had stumbled onto something much bigger, a decades-long conspiracy involving murder, fraud, and corruption at the highest levels. I called Charlotte and Emily, asking them to meet me at a small cafe away from the center. I didn't trust that our offices were secure anymore. Over coffee, I relayed my conversation with Mitchell. Charlotte looked grave, Emily frightened but determined. "He threatened us explicitly," Charlotte said. "That's crossing a line." "He's desperate," I replied, "which means we're close to something important." "The question is, what do we do now?" Emily asked. I had been considering this since Mitchell left. "We need more evidence, hard evidence that connects Chambers' murder to the land deals in the Hamilton Project. Without it, all we have are theories and coincidences." "And where do we find this evidence?" Charlotte asked. "If it exists at all after 30 years, there's one person who might know," I said slowly. "The security guard who testified for the defense in the Talbot case. He saw the loan shark's associate leaving Chambers' office. He might have seen more than he testified to." "Do you think you can find him?" Emily asked. "His name was Malcolm Jensen. He'd be in his 70s now if he's still alive." Charlotte was already tapping on her phone. "I'll start searching public records. Last known address, voter registrations, anything I can find." "While you do that," I said, We need to protect ourselves. I want you both to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't keep to predictable routines. And we need to secure the center's evidence. Everything related to Reynolds, to Chambers, to the Talbot case, it all needs to be digitized and stored securely, multiple copies in multiple locations. They nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. We were no longer just lawyers working on cases. We were investigators uncovering a conspiracy, and that made us targets. 2 days later, Charlotte found Malcolm Jensen living in a small retirement community in southern Georgia. I made the 3-hour drive alone despite my own warnings about safety. This was a conversation I needed to have face-to-face without witnesses. Jensen was sitting on the porch of his small bungalow when I arrived, as if he'd been expecting me. He was thinner than I remembered, his once robust frame now bent with age, but his eyes were still sharp, observant. "William Morgan," he said as I approached. "I wondered if you'd ever come." "You remember me?" I said, surprised. Hard to forget the man who saved Richard Talbot from life in prison. He gestured to a chair beside him. "Sit. We have things to discuss." I sat, studying the old security guard's face. "You know why I'm here?" "The Hamilton Project." He nodded. "I've been following the news. When I saw your name connected to that legal center, and then the center started going after Reynolds, I figured it was just a matter of time. Tell me what you know, Mr. Jensen, about Chambers, about the land, about what really happened." Jensen was silent for a moment, gazing out at the small garden in front of his home. "I saw more that night than I testified to," he finally said. "I saw the Loan Sharks man leave, yes, but I also saw someone else. Someone who arrived after the killing, but before Richard Talbot. Someone who spent nearly an hour in Chambers' office with the dead body." "Who?" "A young attorney, ambitious type. Worked for the Secretary of State's office." Jensen looked at me meaningfully. "Name of Howard Mitchell." Despite my suspicions, hearing it confirmed sent a chill through me. "Did you tell anyone?" "I tried to tell the police. They weren't interested. Said it wasn't relevant to the murder investigation." "I tried to tell you, but your investigator said you only needed testimony about the loan shark's associate to exonerate Talbot." "And that was true, huh?" I acknowledged. "At the time, my only concern was proving Richard's innocence. I didn't see the bigger picture." "None of us did," Jensen sighed. "It was only later, when I read about the property transfers, that I started to wonder. Chambers had been boasting about a big land deal, something that would set him up for life. Then he's killed, and suddenly those same properties are changing hands in ways that don't make sense. And Mitchell was facilitating those transfers through his position at the Secretary of State's office." I finished. Jensen nodded. "He was there that night to get something. Documents maybe, or electronic files. Something Chambers had that would have exposed the whole scheme." "Would you be willing to testify to this now?" I asked. The old man smiled sadly. "That's why you're here, isn't it? But testify to what exactly?" "That 30 years ago, I saw a man enter an office after a murder that I had suspicions that were never investigated. It's not much to build a case on." "It's a start," I insisted, "especially combined with what we already know." Jensen studied me for a long moment. "You never could let go of a case, could you, Morgan? Even after all these years, you're still the guardian fighting for justice." "Justice doesn't expire," I said simply. He nodded, coming to a decision. "I kept records, notes from that night, news clippings about the property transfers, anything that seemed connected. I was a security guard, but before that I was a cop for 20 years. I know about preserving evidence." My heart quickened. "Do you still have these records?" "In a safe deposit box at First National in Atlanta. I haven't looked at them in years, but they're there. I'll sign whatever you need to access them." The drive back to Atlanta was tense, my mind racing with possibilities. Jensen's testimony alone wouldn't be enough, but if his records contained concrete evidence linking Mitchell to the scene of Chambers' murder, to the property transfers, to the conspiracy that had culminated in the Hamilton Project, I was so preoccupied that I almost missed the car that had been following me since I left Jensen's home. A dark sedan, maintaining a consistent distance matching my turns. When I changed lanes unnecessarily, it followed. When I sped up, it kept pace. I called Charlotte. "I think I'm being followed," I said without preamble. "Dark sedan, 2 men inside from what I can see." "Where are you?" She asked, her voice tense. "About an hour outside Atlanta, Highway 75. "Can you make it to a public place, a rest stop, a busy gas station?" "I'll try." I spotted a sign for a travel plaza at the next exit and signaled to turn off the highway. The sedan followed. The travel plaza was busy, filled with families and truckers taking breaks from their journeys. I parked near the entrance in full view of security cameras and walked quickly inside. Through the windows, I could see the sedan circling the parking lot slowly. After a few minutes, it departed, but I had no doubt they would be waiting when I returned to the road. I called Kevin Harris. "I need help," I said, explaining the situation. "If these people are working for who I think they are, they won't be deterred by ordinary precautions." Kevin was silent for a moment. "Stay where you are," he finally said. "I'm sending someone." 40 minutes later, a state police car pulled into the travel plaza. The trooper who approached me was young but carried himself with authority. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "Justice Harris asked me to provide you with an escort back to Atlanta." Relief washed over me. "Thank you, officer." With the trooper leading the way, I returned to my car and back to the highway. The dark sedan was nowhere in sight, apparently unwilling to pursue me with law enforcement present. Back in Atlanta, I went straight to the First National Bank. Jensen had called ahead, authorizing me to access his safe deposit box. Inside was a thick folder of documents, Jensen's contemporaneous notes from the night of Chambers' murder, describing in detail how he had observed Howard Mitchell enter and leave the office, news clippings about the subsequent property transfers, and most damning of all, photographs Jensen had taken surreptitiously of Mitchell, leaving the building, carrying a briefcase that he hadn't had when he entered. It was circumstantial, but it was evidence. Combined with the financial records linking those properties to the Hamilton Project, it painted a compelling picture of a conspiracy spanning decades. I secured the documents in my own safe deposit box, then went to meet Charlotte and Emily at our prearranged location, a quiet corner table in the law library at Emory University. Jensen confirmed it. I told him, keeping my voice low. Mitchell was there the night Chambers was killed. He took documents from the office, and Jensen has evidence. Charlotte's eyes widened, enough to take to the authorities. I hesitated. That's the problem. Who do we trust? Mitchell has connections throughout the justice system. The Attorney General's office, where Marcus now works, would be the normal channel for investigating corruption of this magnitude. What about the FBI? Emily suggested. This crosses into federal jurisdiction, financial fraud, possibly wire fraud, if they used electronic means for the property transfers. That might be our best option, I agreed. But before we go that route, I want to confront Reynolds directly. Their involvement in the Hamilton Project makes them vulnerable, and the class action gives us leverage. You want to use the lawsuit as a wedge, Charlotte realized. Exactly. If we can get Reynolds to settle the class action on favorable terms, including cooperation with an investigation into the Hamilton Project, then we can build a stronger case against Mitchell and whoever else is involved, Emily finished. But will Reynolds agree? They have a lot to lose. They have more to lose if they don't cooperate, I pointed out. Right now, they're facing a civil lawsuit. If they're implicated in the conspiracy, they could face criminal charges. We spent the next 2 days preparing our strategy. Charlotte worked with our litigation team to compile the strongest possible presentation of the class action claims. Emily used her corporate law expertise to identify Reynolds' potential exposure if the Hamilton Project collapsed. I focused on organizing Jensen's evidence and connecting it to the current situation. Meanwhile, Kevin Harris arranged for discreet security for the center and for each of us personally. He also reached out to contacts in the federal judiciary, laying groundwork for possible FBI involvement if our confrontation with Reynolds failed. The meeting with Reynolds Construction's CEO, Victor Reynolds, and their general counsel was scheduled for Wednesday morning at their headquarters. As we prepared to leave the center, Emily received a text message that made her face pale. "It's from Marcus," she said, showing me the screen. The message was simple but chilling. "Tell your father to back off, last warning." "He knows about the meeting," I said. "Someone inside Reynolds must have informed Mitchell." "What do we do?" Emily asked, clearly frightened. I considered our options. Canceling would show weakness and lose momentum. Proceeding was risky, but we had security in place, and the more public our actions, the safer we would be. We go forward, I decided, but we take precautions. Kevin's security team will accompany us, and we make sure people know where we are and what we're doing. The Reynolds headquarters was an imposing glass tower in Midtown Atlanta. As our small convoy approached my car, flanked by 2 security vehicles, I could see figures watching from the upper windows. They were expecting us. In the lobby, security was heavy but professional. We were escorted directly to a large conference room on the top floor, where Victor Reynolds awaited with his legal team. Marcus was not present, but his influence hung in the air. "Mr. Morgan," Reynolds greeted me with forced cordiality, "I understand you have a settlement proposal for us." "I do," I replied. "But first I think we should discuss the Hamilton project and your company's involvement in it." Reynolds' expression didn't change, but his attorney stiffened noticeably. "I don't see how that's relevant to the class action," Reynolds said carefully. "It's relevant because the same practices we've documented in your rental properties, cutting corners, ignoring safety regulations, manipulating public officials, appear in your work on the Hamilton project. And that project itself is built on a foundation of fraud, corruption, and murder." The room went silent. Reynolds' attorney started to object, but Reynolds himself raised a hand, stopping him. "Those are serious allegations, Mr. Morgan. I hope you can substantiate them." "I can," I said, opening my briefcase. "Beginning with the murder of Edward Chambers in '92 and continuing through the complex series of property transfers that eventually placed his land under the control of the Hamilton Project Consortium." For the next hour, I laid out the evidence, Jensen's testimony and documentation, the financial records connecting Reynolds to the Hamilton Project, the pattern of regulatory favoritism that had allowed the development to proceed despite environmental and zoning concerns. When I finished, Reynolds dismissed his attorneys, asking them to wait outside. When we were alone, he spoke with unexpected candor. "I inherited this company from my father," he said quietly. "He was the one who entered into the arrangement with Mitchell and the others. I suspected there were irregularities, but I never knew the full extent." "And now that you do?" Charlotte asked. Reynolds looked tired suddenly, the polished executive facade cracking. "What do you want from me?" "Full compensation for the tenants in the class action," I said. "Immediate remediation of all safety issues in your properties, and your cooperation in the investigation of Howard Mitchell and the Hamilton Project conspiracy. If I agree, my company will survive." "We're not interested in destroying Reynolds Construction," I assured him. "We want justice for the tenants and for Edward Chambers. Your cooperation makes both possible." He considered for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll need guarantees, immunity agreements, protection." "We can arrange that," Charlotte said, "but we'll need your complete honesty and full cooperation." "You'll have it," Reynolds promised. "Starting with this, Mitchell isn't just worried about exposure. He's actively working to silence anyone who might connect him to Chambers or the original land deals. That includes you, Mr. Morgan. The threats, the vandalism, the men following me, that was all Mitchell." "Yes, and he's growing desperate. The Hamilton Project is in its final phases. Once completed, the original land transactions will be buried under layers of corporate restructuring. He just needs a few more months without interference." Which explains the urgency of his threats, I realized, and the timing of Marcus's appointment to the Attorney General's office. Reynolds nodded grimly. "You need to be careful. Mitchell has resources connections, and he has everything to lose." As we left the Reynolds building, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, satisfaction at the progress we'd made, anxiety about Mitchell's desperation, and a growing certainty that we were approaching the final confrontation. Emily seemed similarly affected. "What happens now?" she asked as we walked to our cars. "Now we take everything to the FBI, I said. "Reynolds' cooperation gives us the opening we need. With his testimony and Jensen's evidence, they'll have to investigate." "Mitchell will fight back," Charlotte warned. "He won't go quietly." "No," I agreed. "He won't." The next morning, I arrived at the center early to prepare for our meeting with the FBI. The building was quiet, the staff not due for another hour. I went straight to my office to gather the documents we would need. As I unlocked my door, I sensed immediately that something was wrong. There was a stillness in the air, a subtle change in the room that put me on alert. I reached for the light switch, but hesitated, suddenly certain I wasn't alone. "I knew you'd be early," Howard Mitchell said from the darkness. "Always the first to arrive, last to leave. Some things never change." He was sitting in my chair, his form barely visible in the dim light filtering through the blinds. I could see the outline of something in his hand, a gun pointed steadily in my direction. "Is this how you solve all your problems, Howard?" I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the pounding of my heart. "When legal maneuvering fails, resort to violence. I prefer to think of it as cutting my losses," he replied. The Reynolds situation is unfortunate, but containable. Victor's word against mine, essentially. But you're the real threat. You always have been. The guardian champion of lost causes and inconvenient truths. I remained by the door, assessing my options. The security Kevin had arranged wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes. Calling out would likely provoke Mitchell. My only choice was to keep him walking. You were at Chambers' office that night, I said. Jensen saw you, he has photographs. Mitchell laughed softly. An old man's word decades after the fact. Hardly compelling evidence. Combined with the financial records, the property transfers Reynolds' testimony, it's more than enough for an investigation. And once the FBI starts digging, they won't, Mitchell cut in, because you won't be making that call. It's over, Will. The Hamilton project will be completed. The past will stay buried. And you, he raised the gun slightly, you'll have a tragic accident, a disturbed former client perhaps seeking revenge. So sad, especially with your center doing such good work. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone else had arrived early. Mitchell heard them too, tensing in the chair. In here, I shouted, diving to the side as Mitchell fired. The bullet splintered the door frame where I had been standing. The footsteps broke into a run. Mitchell fired again, the sound deafening in the confined space. I scrambled behind a filing cabinet as the door burst open. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene, her father crouched behind a filing cabinet, Howard Mitchell rising from the desk, gun in hand. Emily, run, I shouted. But she didn't run. Instead, she did something that stopped both Mitchell and me in our tracks. She raised her own hand, revealing a small recorder. It's over, Mitchell, she said, her voice steadier than I would have believed possible. I've been recording since I entered the building. Your confession, your threats, the gunshots all captured, and live streaming to Charlotte and Kevin Harris. Mitchell's face contorted with rage. He swung the gun toward Emily. I lunged from behind the filing cabinet, driven by pure paternal instinct. My body slammed into Mitchell as the gun went off again. We crashed to the floor together, struggling for control of the weapon. Despite his desk job, Mitchell was strong, fueled by desperation. We rolled across the floor, each fighting for advantage. The gun discharged again, the bullet hitting the ceiling. Then suddenly the room was filled with people, security officers, early arriving staff, and leading them Charlotte. Strong hands pulled Mitchell away from me, disarming him and forcing him to the ground. As handcuffs were secured around his wrists, Mitchell looked up at me with pure hatred. This isn't over, he spat. You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved. Maybe not, I acknowledged, breathing heavily as I got to my feet. But we'll find out. That's what the Guardian does. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. FBI agents arrived within the hour, taking custody of Mitchell and beginning the process of unraveling the conspiracy. Reynolds provided crucial testimony detailing his company's involvement and naming others who had participated in the decades-long scheme. Kevin Harris used his influence to ensure the investigation remained independent and free from political interference. The Hamilton project was suspended pending the investigation, its future uncertain. Other legal aid organizations joined our coalition, pursuing similar cases against developers and officials implicated in the scheme. And through it all, the Thomas Morgan Justice Center continued its work, representing clients fighting injustice, building the legacy that my brother and I had once dreamed of. 2 months after Mitchell's arrest, on a crisp autumn evening, I sat on the center's porch with Emily, watching the sunset. We had fallen into a comfortable routine of ending our days this way, discussing cases, sharing insights, gradually rebuilding the father-daughter relationship that had been so badly damaged. The FBI interviewed Marcus again today, she said, sipping her coffee. They offered him a deal, full immunity, in exchange for complete cooperation against the remaining conspirators. Will he take it? I asked. She nodded. His lawyer called me. He's already signed the agreement. How do you feel about that? Emily considered the question thoughtfully, relieved mostly. Despite everything, I wouldn't have wanted to see him go to prison. But also sad. Sad that I never really knew the man I married, that I was so blind to who he really was. We all have blind spots, I said gently. I certainly did with you. I saw what I expected to see, a daughter who had become a stranger rather than looking deeper. I gave you reason to think that, she acknowledged. I was so focused on success, on status, on all the things that don't really matter. It took almost losing you to make me see clearly. We fell silent, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The center's lights came on automatically, illuminating the gardens and pathways with a soft glow. "I found something in Mom's things," Emily said after a while. "A letter she wrote to me that she never sent. She knew she was dying even before she told any of us. In the letter, she asked me to take care of you, to understand why you might withdraw from the world without her. She said, oh," Emily's voice caught. "She said that loving someone means accepting their grief, their process, their journey back to themselves." Tears filled my eyes. Even now, years after her death, Sarah was still taking care of us, still helping us find our way back to each other. "Your mother was the wisest person I've ever known," I said softly. Emily nodded, wiping her own tears. "I'm trying to be more like her, to focus on what matters, helping others, fighting for what's right, being there for the people I love." "You are," I assured her. "Every day I see more of her in you, and more of the person you were always meant to be." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'd like to come work here full-time," she said. "Not just evenings and weekends. I've been offered a partnership at the firm, but this feels more important." Joy surged through me, but I kept my expression serious. The pay would be significantly less, the hours just as long, the challenges perhaps greater. "I know," she said simply. "That's why I want to do it." I reached over and took her hand, my heart full. "The center would be honored to have you, and so would I." As night fell, completely wrapping the countryside in darkness, punctuated by stars and the center's gentle lights, I thought about the journey that had brought us here, from grief to solitude to confrontation to reconciliation, from loss to purpose. Thomas had given me more than property and money. He had given me one last case, one final purpose, one more chance to be the guardian. And in pursuing that purpose, I had found something even more precious: my daughter, my family, my place in the world again. "A penny for your thoughts, Pop," Emily said, using the old nickname without irony or coldness for the first time in years. "I was thinking about legacy," I replied, "about what we leave behind. Thomas left this center, this opportunity. Your mother left her wisdom, her love. I hope to leave something worthwhile too." "You already have," Emily said firmly. "The Guardian's legacy is secure, but you're not done adding to it yet." I smiled at her faith in me and the work we were doing together. "No," I agreed, "not done yet." In the distance, a pair of headlights appeared on the driveway, Charlotte returning from a late meeting. In the morning, the center would be busy again, filled with clients seeking help, staff, attorneys fighting their battles, volunteers learning to become advocates for justice. And I would be there alongside my daughter and my oldest friend, continuing the work that had defined my life, that had been interrupted but never truly abandoned. The work of justice, of fairness, of standing between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. The work of the guardian.